On June 8, 1972, a group of 22 investors were awarded with an NHL expansion team that would be based in the heart of the American Midwest. The group would have the team set up in Kansas City, Missouri, and the group led by Edwin G. Thompson would commence their time in the NHL in 1974, with the team being known as the Kansas City Scouts. The Scouts would join the NHL for the 74-75 NHL season alongside the Washington Capitals, but their time in the NHL was very brief, with the Scouts facing a number of challenges both on and off the ice, which ultimately led to the team's relocation after just 2 seasons in the NHL. Hello everyone, my name is King Gratz and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be discussing the story of the Kansas City Scouts and their very brief NHL history, and precisely I'll be looking at the challenges of the organization, what they were facing both on and off the ice, and what led to its ultimate relocation in 1976. There will be some side-by-side comparison with the Washington Capitals and explaining why the Capitals were able to survive this period of the NHL's history books, but this will primarily be focusing on the Scouts and their failure in the NHL. So the Scouts would join the NHL, as I mentioned, in 1974. This was the second duo expansion by the NHL in the 1970s, which was more of a direct response to the WHA because of the fact that the World Hockey Association had done a great job of getting into the smaller to medium-sized markets of North America, which the NHL had a very lackluster presence in. The NHL was already present in Missouri through the St. Louis Blues, who came in the 1967 expansion, so Kansas City would be the second team to enter the area. And the thing is that Kansas City is not a traditional hockey market, but it's definitely a sports market. The Kansas City Royals of the MLB, the Kansas City Chiefs of the NFL, who were prominent at this time. There was also at that point the NBA in town with the Kansas City Omaha Kings, and so there was genuine hope that maybe the Scouts could become an example of what the NHL could look like in a non-traditional hockey market and potentially grow the game in an unorthodox environment. Now, the first major hurdle for the Scouts alongside the Capitals was the expansion draft in 1974, and the big problem with the expansion draft in that year was that there were already so many teams between the NHL and the WHA that the overall talent pool was extremely stretched thin. And at the same time, there were also major protections that were made for the existing NHL teams for the draft. In total, the Scouts and Capitals had to select 22 players in the expansion draft each, and they can only pick at max 3 skaters and 1 goalie from one franchise. When you look at the existing NHL teams, they were allowed to protect 15 skaters and 2 goalies, and if a team had lost a goalie earlier back in 1972 when the NHL brought in the New York Islanders and the Atlanta Flames, then that team would be exempt from losing a goalie in the 74 expansion draft. And so as a result of the NHL trying to basically close the gap with the WHA, the existing talent pool that would be made available to the Scouts and the Capitals was extremely weak, and this resulted in a pretty poor expansion draft as a whole. Now, looking at the Scouts in particular, the 2 best players they picked up were Michel Place, who was a goaltender from the Montreal Canadiens, and Simon Nollet, who would actually become the team's first captain in their inaugural season, in which he was picked up from the just crowned Stanley Cup champion Philadelphia Flyers. Now, the Scouts would be playing out of Kemper Arena. This was a huge arena, by the way. At its peak, I think it can hold about 19,000 people. Around the NHL period, it would be around 17,500, which was still well above the NHL league average for an arena capacity. And this arena was also being shared along with the NBA's Kings franchise. Unfortunately, the Scouts could not get this arena upgraded in time for the 74-75 season opener. So as a result, the Scouts actually spent the first part of their inaugural season on the road with an 8-game road trip which started in Toronto before they would play their first home game in Kansas City. The team lost 7 of its first 8 games, only recording 1 tie in that span before coming home to Missouri and playing their first game, which was against the Chicago Blackhawks, I believe. The team actually wouldn't win their first game until their second road trip when they played the Washington Capitals. Like most expansion teams, the Scouts were pretty bad. Their final record was 15 wins, 54 losses, and 11 ties, but compared to what the Washington Capitals had done, it was actually not that bad. Of course, the Capitals would set the modern NHL record for the worst losing season ever, with just 8 wins, 67 losses, and 5 ties in the 74-75 season. If you think about it, the Scouts' failure wasn't as bad, but it was still expected for an expansion team. the Scouts were expected to get better over time, but one big problem was that fan attendance plummeted when the team was struggling. And as a result of the fan attendance plummeting, the overall debt for the investment group was already mounting up. The concern for the lack of fan support for the Scouts was so intense that the NHL-PA at the time was actually concerned that the Scouts may not even make payroll for the following season. Now, the 1975-76 season, in comparison, was actually a little bit more bright in its beginning. The Scouts were actually close to a playoff spot by the halfway point of that season, but unfortunately, they went on a complete nosedive in the second half. Between December 30th and February 4th, they would not win a single game, only recording 2 ties in 16 contests, and then they would win 1 game against the Capitals on February 7th, and then they would not win a single game for the rest of the season, going 0-21-6. The Scouts would plummet well into the bottom of the standings, finishing with a record of 12 wins, 56 losses, and 12 ties, with just 36 points, which today stands as the worst season in the Scouts' history, of course, in the Colorado Rockies and the New Jersey Devils franchise history, considering that this team did relocate on multiple occasions. Even though the Scouts technically had already played their final season in the NHL, the team was still active outside of the NHL. Their last few games were actually played in Japan. They played in a 4-game exhibition series against the Washington Capitals, where they played 2 games in Sapporo, which was the site of the 1972 Winter Olympics, and they also played 2 games out of the Yoyogi National Gymnasium, which was at the site of the diving competitions for the 1964 Summer Olympics. The Scouts were also pretty garbage in this series, losing 3 out of 4 games, and the only time that they would win was on April 18th, 1976, which was the final game of the exhibition series, beating Washington 4-2. And thus, Kansas City would win its final game, but of course it did not count for any points in the NHL standings. Now, the Scouts really suffered from numerous factors, and this ultimately would lead to the team's relocation after just their sophomore year. Now, as I mentioned, Kansas City was not a traditional hockey market, so as a result, the team had to compete with a lot more popular franchises. Notably, I talked about the Royals of the MLB and the Chiefs of the NFL, so they had to find a way to really generate attention early on if they were going to survive. And so the only way they could really do that is if they were successful right off the bat. And unfortunately, for a traditional expansion team in the mid-1970s, that just simply wasn't possible. And in addition, when you look at the 1970s as a whole, this was a terrible time economically. The 70s was a period of record inflation, and this was, of course, exacerbated by the situation between the NHL and the WHA with rising player contracts, and this, of course, would stretch a lot of owners, not just Kansas City, when it comes to operating costs. And for the Scouts ownership group, they didn't have a lot of financial capital. And this is important because if you compare the Scouts with the Capitals, who the Capitals at the time were owned by Abe Paulin, Paulin had a lot more financial flexibility. And as a result, though the Capitals were struggling on the ice and were bleeding money, just like the Scouts were, Paulin had both the patience and the financial muscle to survive and soak up these hits. Unlike him, the Scouts basically had no real options left, and a lot of the owners in the investment group were already into a serious amount of debt by the time you get to the sophomore season for the Scouts franchise. The American Midwest was also suffering a major economic downturn in the 1970s, so this obviously further compounds the problems for the Scouts financially speaking. After the first 2 or 3 seasons after the 74 expansion, the whole duo expansion of the Scouts and Capitals was seen as an absolute failure, but things would turn around. In particular, I'm looking at Washington here, but for the Scouts, things just did not go well. If you want to compound this a little bit further, they averaged just a little bit over 8,000 people per game at Kemper Arena, which was not great considering that the league average was approximately 13,000 when it comes to seating capacity, and Kemper Arena just blew past that. The ownership group was buried in debt, and by the time you get to 1976, the ownership group actually jumped to 37 people. So you got a much larger consortium here. They would mount a season ticket drive in preparation for the 76-77 NHL season, but this was also a failure as they only sold about 2,000 season tickets, and as a result, the ownership group decided to sell and move on. As soon as the team was put up for sale, the first major prospective buyer was a Denver-based group that was led by Jack Vickers, who was interested in buying the Scouts and relocating the team to Denver, Colorado. The NHL was interested in having the team get sold to Vickers, but there was a local group that was consisting of some of the members of the existing ownership group who wanted to buy the team themselves. This group, which was led by Gene Novore and George Shore, they were met with competition and, if anything, interference by the NHL. So the NHL actually informed the Scouts owners that if they were to sell the team to the local group, then the ownership group would actually have to face millions of dollars that would have to be paid as indemnities to the St. Louis Blues because the team was operating in the Missouri region. As a result, with this threat, the Scouts owners decided to sell the team to Jack Vickers, who would then promptly relocate the franchise in preparation for the 1976-77 season to Colorado, where they became the Colorado Rockies. The Scouts, I think, should be seen as an example of what could go wrong with expansion, particularly when you're looking at a very diluted talent pool, which has been a genuine argument for debate when it comes to whether or not sports leagues should expand further than what they already have. And this has always been a topic in hockey as well. And as mentioned, the talent pool was I think even further diluted in the 70s compared to what we have today in the NHL, simply because of what the NHL and the WHA were doing at the time. This, of course, would lead to a weak expansion draft and also an inability of the Scouts to really accrue enough talent to actually build a competitive roster early on, which was vital for the organization's success. The team would become the Colorado Rockies, and they also didn't have much success either. In fact, the team was downright awful. Eventually, the team would relocate a second time due to a number of financial issues as well. But the franchise would officially relocate again in 1982, becoming the New Jersey Devils, where the franchise continues to exist today. The Scouts, in particular, are sort of a forgotten part of NHL history. I mean, I would say it's forgotten because people probably remember more about the Rockies and how much futility they went through compared to what the Scouts were going through. And at the same time, the New Jersey Devils don't really acknowledge the history of the Rockies and the Scouts. The very little acknowledgement, I think, is part of the reason why many younger hockey fans perhaps don't really know much about the Kansas City Scouts and what valuable lesson the team's history actually provides when it comes to understanding NHL expansion and why it's so important to eventually set a fine line as to how far you're willing to expand. The story of the Kansas City Scouts is a microcosm of the volatile situation between the NHL and the WHA, and I think that they provide a very valuable lesson for all of us that we should probably all understand. Just looking at the NHL, and this really kind of explains one of the examples of how the NHL was trying to stave off the WHA's rising presence in North America, and also the consequences of, as I said, of having a diluted talent pool and having too many teams active at once, which is the common argument for modern day NHL expansion. But that's all I have. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked the video, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this one. Thank you again, and I'll see you all in my next video.